Welcome, Dolphin, to Conscious Conversations. How are you doing?
Really good. Thank you so much for you two having me. Just excited to jump into a meaningful conversation.
Awesome. And welcome everyone to the show. I'm Nitin Garg. I'm joined by Nick Palladino King today as well. And today we have the honor to speak with Dolphin Kasper. Dolphin has been a relationship breakthrough coach for over 20 years. He's Canadian born, lives in Edmonton, and for the last a great majority of time, Dolphin has been focused on how to help people really connect with deep currents in their relationships and what's holding them back. What are the even sabotaging behaviors we sometimes bring into our relationships that keep us from creating that loving, joyful, intimate relationship that we all really seek, but somehow things get in the way. So today seems like it may be we'll see where the conversation goes. We have not necessarily narrowed on one specific things, but that is definitely a great part of Dolphin's 20-year background. So Dolphin, anything you want to add to that? Anything I may have missed that you want to highlight for the audience?
No, I think that's good. I think who I am and how I work and kind of where I sit in relation to what's difficult about relationships will come through in the conversation. And yeah, I'm happy to jump into a grounding exercise and a little story from my life that, again, I think will help people understand where I'm coming from.
Awesome. Yeah, we love to get started just like that. So please take it away and kick us off.
Cool. So what I want to start with is for people to, if you're listening wherever you are, in whatever way you're able to just get into a comfortable, grounded position. You might be preparing some food, you might be in your car, you might be lounging out at home, but see if you can get into a comfortable position where your body can relax a little bit. And I'd like you to bring in this principle that I often use in my work and in my life, which is that life really knows what it's doing. So just allow that statement and whatever it means to you to sort of sink in, take a couple of deep breaths. What does it mean if life really knows what it's doing, in spite of the difficulties and the chaos and the seeming incompatibilities of life, is all part of a kind of tapestry, a kind of symphony, and we just haven't quite figured out how to make sense of it yet. So let that sort of land in you. And one of the instruments of coming into relationship with that trust of life in that symphony is our moment by moment experiences. And so I'm going to encourage you just to bring an awareness to your body, to the feelings that you have, to your sensory experience. If you can close your eyes, that's good to do. If you're driving, please don't do that. And just notice, instead of experiencing life as a kind of reaction where things are happening and you're having experiences and you're reacting to those things, what if the experiences you're having are a message from life, a simple resonance, a simple signpost for you of something that you're meant to first receive and then to begin to act upon? So what would it mean if this ache in your lower back or this tension in your throat or this heat across your forehead, what would it mean if that had a message for you? What would it mean if your body and your mind and the circumstances around you are all organized in a way to deliver the exact message you need to do what you're meant to do in this moment? And so there's a progression of this where we start to translate what that message is. It might start just by coming into full relationship with the experience, with the sensation in your body, or the sound of the birds, or the traffic, or whatever might be going on. And then we can start to feel like, what is this moment asking of me? And what I'll encourage is for you to take that question away with you. That if you can create space and time in your day, even just for a minute or two, to slow down enough to fully be with what's occurring and to ask yourself that question, what is this moment asking for of me? And that as we start to learn to listen in this way more deeply, and we start to play in the space, like don't become an expert right away, but we start to play in the space of what would it mean for me to answer that question? What is this moment asking for? And to act out, to live out our answer, whatever it is, and to begin to discover how to live life in a way where we're first listening and receiving the message, and then actively responding to what we hear in that message with our whole heart, with our full intention, and with our desire to create more love and more of a connection to the meaning of our lives. So just take a couple more breaths to allow that to settle into you. And again, you can take this practice away as something that you use and over time become much more fluent in receiving the message of life and responding with something that genuinely addresses what life is asking for. And now I've been requested from my hosts here on the podcast to think of a story that stands out to me as a kind of poignant signpost for me in my life around, what am I really up to and what's life about. And what, there's a bunch that came up, but what came forward as the one to share today was my first real relationship. So I was 16 years old and I was in summer school. I had slacked off and been a bad student and had failed a course that I needed to graduate. And so between grade 11 and grade 12, I was in summer school and I met this girl, and her house was nearby, and we would go and hang out. And over time, we got quite close, and we ended up starting a relationship. And yeah, again, it was the first time I'd ever had like a girlfriend as such. And as things happened, by Christmas, she had gone away for a couple of weeks, and things had started to get a little bit crunchy for us. And when she got back, we couldn't find a way to sort of re-enter the relationship or to kind of pick the relationship back up. And so I said, hey, let's break up. And what was interesting, or what was poignant about this relationship, was that at the start, when we were hanging out and we were friends, she said to me, it was a very poignant moment. She said, Dolphin, like, I really care about you and you mean a lot to me. And if we're going to, explore something romantic, I want you to promise me that if that doesn't work out, that we're going to stay friends. I think that's really important to me. And, 16-year-old guy, I was like, yeah, sure, of course, no problem. No relationship experience. And what ended up happening was we were basically out of contact for most of the year that followed our breakup. And I got a call at one point. A friend of mine called and said, hey, did you hear what happened? I said, what? I don't know. And she said, oh, Brittany died. She passed away. She was snowboarding and, fell out of bounds. And yeah, so she had passed away. And I went to her funeral a few weeks later. And I remember that conversation that we had about me promising that I would stay friends, and that it was clear that I didn't honor that promise. And of course, in my own mind, if I had been asked, I would have said, oh yeah, at some point, yeah, okay, we'll figure that out, or we'll resolve that. And what was really left with me is, oh, I don't have time to not honor the things that are most important. The idea that we have time somewhere off in the distant future to do the things that are actually most meaningful to do is an illusion. And that was a real awakening for me in my life. It was a real recognition that I needed to be more, not more serious, but more, I needed to be in integrity with my word and with what mattered to me in real time. And that really shifted the trajectory of my life. I think I got much more connected to my purpose. I got much more connected to why it's important to live with integrity and openness and honesty and courage. And that experience continues to influence me in my life.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Dolphin. I know it's probably not easy, but I appreciate the candidness and the openness there. And it's bringing up thoughts of some of my first girlfriends and experiences. And something you just said that really landed was that we don't have time to look at these things later. And as you were saying that, I was starting to think about my relationship with my wife and how I do that. I think, okay, like, well, we're having this challenge or having these issues, but either they'll go away or I'll get to it tomorrow, or I'm going to wait until she brings it up and then I'll bring it up. So as you were sharing that, it really brought up in me how I do that a lot. I'm wondering, what tips do you have as we're going to dive into relationships today? What tips do you have for us as people in relationships, either with ourselves or partners, to not put off the conversation that we should be having today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of places we could go with things that I think would be helpful. I want to point out two things that came through in what you just shared. One of them is that it's really helpful to have what I often talk about as meta awareness. So you're aware that thing happens, where there's something it's important, it's a bit crunchy, or there's in some way there's distance between you two that you don't want to have, and there's a deferral. Like, oh yeah, some other time. It's too inconvenient right now. Like, whatever. I think it's important for us to recognize we can't do all the things all the time. So this is not, me thinking that people should be superhuman and do all the things. But it is true that in any given moment, we can be more or less open to life. And in any given moment, we can be more or less available to what life is calling for in us. And in any moment, we can be more or less responsive to whatever it is that life is calling for. And even though it seems as though time passes and we get to things down the road, the reality is there's only this moment. There's only this moment and what I choose to do with it. And if I defer now, what I'm investing in is a kind of overvaluing of the benefit of deferral. And I'm putting that over first my open connection to my own life, my open connection to my own heart, and through that my own open connection to the people close to me. So I'm sacrificing those pieces that, just when we're really honest, obviously matter more, for something that matters less. And so that's the kind of meta frame or perspective that I think can help us just to see things a little bit more honestly and clearly. And then the other thing that I think helps is that if we look at why we would do that, why would I trade something that matters less for something that matters, or why would I trade something that matters more for something that matters less? And we have all sorts of reasons, and we can get into some of those reasons. But what helps is for us to have some way that we regularly reconnect with what makes it worth facing what's hard, so we can honor what matters most. And I'll say that again. What helps us make sense of facing what's hard so we can take care of what matters most? If we can have some way, and whether it's a talisman or an object or a mantra or whatever helps us to have something that we touch into regularly that reminds us why it's so important and why it's worth doing the hard thing, then it's more present for us. It's more available, especially when things get a bit crunchy or difficult, which of course they will with the people close to us. We can be more present to, oh yeah, here's another one of those moments where it gets hard and I'd rather it not be hard. And oh yeah, I know that what I really want to do here is not run away. I want to show up and find a way for this moment to reveal and honor the meaning of my life instead of avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's perfect. As you're talking, what's coming up for me is this saying of your why has to be greater than your why not. And it's like, what is my reason? What's my intention here in this relationship? And that has got to be greater than the avoidance or the ease of not doing the hard thing or not having the hard conversation. I'm wondering then, Dolphin, as a second question, then, is how can we be more vulnerable with that? Because I think, and especially as I'll say as a man and as three men here, it's like, I think that can be really challenging sometimes, is to say, okay, here's this conversation I want to have, but I don't know if I'm ready to be vulnerable and open, and I don't know if I'm ready for the feedback. So what insights do you have on us to be more open so that we can step into these conversations when we know they're going to be crunchy, as you said, and they're going to be challenging?
Okay,
Yeah,
I have a couple of answers to that. And I want to go back to what you said there. It was maybe a quote, or I don't know where you got it from, like our why has to be more important than our why not. And I just want to rephrase that.
Yeah.
Our why is more important than our why not. And our job is not to convince ourselves of that, but to remember it. So, and that's a subtle thing. And I'm not making the quote wrong. I think it's pointing to the same thing. But
it's my quote. No offense taken. I like it. It's an upgrade.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the difference is that, especially in sort of a modern Western culture, we're constantly in a paradigm or a mindset of like overpowering the bad stuff. How do we figure out how to convince ourselves to do the good thing or the right thing? And what if it wasn't really that way? Like I said at the beginning, what if life really knows what it's doing? What if everything really is as it needs to be? And it's not a matter of us trying to get at it or figure it out, but to rediscover what's already there. So the meaning of doing the good thing, what makes that inherently good and worth it, is already there. And what's happened is we've just laid over top of that truth some misunderstandings and distortions of what matters more than what. So that's a starting place. In terms of what to do, like I have two answers to that question. Like how do we, especially as men, get more vulnerable? And I've had some interesting conversations around vulnerability with people. I don't believe vulnerability is a skill. Like at the heart of vulnerability, what I see is an agency to open to life and to become transparent to life. And of course, in that, transparent to ourselves and others. So I don't think vulnerability as such is something we can grow into. But there are all sorts of things we can do to remind ourselves what vulnerability is and why it's so valuable. And so I'll give a really, and this is a very, maybe a more masculine example, especially if you're a man who's been involved in sport. If you take a 10-year-old kid and that plays basketball, say, and you put them in the NBA finals to take the game-winning shot with 3 seconds left, the likelihood that they make that shot is essentially zero. They're not there yet. So there's a skill capacity component to some of what we do in life. But that 10-year-old kid can be open and explorative of where he is at. So his exploration of his strengths and vulnerabilities in life is something he can choose to be fully in or to be somehow compensating for or out of touch with. And so in regards to your question, first, vulnerability is not something we learn to do. It's something we can choose or not choose. And then second, for men that might struggle with vulnerability, for them to identify maybe one or two areas of life where they can see they resist being vulnerable and that they can see would be really good to be vulnerable, and to begin exploring vulnerability in a safe space. So don't go to the deepest, darkest cave of your innermost and try to be vulnerable there if you're a man who hasn't done that much. I mean, if you're ready to just completely die, then you're ready. But for men that are looking to dip their toe and to begin to lean into vulnerability so that they can learn over time what it means to be vulnerable, then identify something. And so for some men, that might be like their weekend sport league that they join, and they have a way of being around their buddies that they know is not fully transparent or open. And so you might start to have slightly more open, honest conversations with those people that you play sports with, as an example. With your partner, it might just be settings like, hey, honey, like let's set up a time on Sunday to sit down and just have a conversation without intention. Like, let's just create a space where we can be together. A lot of adult relationships don't make that time. It sounds crazy, yeah. But to just have time and space, not to process or fix or change, like there's room for setting that stuff up too. Like there's value there, but even just, we're going to intentionally be together and intentionally not fill the space with devices or with chores or with whatever, and just look at each other and see like, hey, what do I want to say to you right now? So there's ways that I think as men in particular, we can start to dip our toe, lean in, create these accessible spaces to be more transparent and vulnerable than we're used to. And then that can be a kind of doorway to all of the levels and layers that vulnerability can take us. And I believe vulnerability is an unavoidable, magical kind of key to all of the doors of life that are worth entering. And it costs us anything that we've protected ourselves against.
I also feel, as you're saying that, like there's like a depth of relationship that comes from that. Like it was, as you were talking, I was almost trying to understand, like, okay, it's like maybe it's not a skill, it's almost like a behavior, and that behavior has some upsides. Like I've noticed, for example, one of the safest places I've found as a man to be vulnerable is like with one of my really good friends, one of my best friends. And I could share something that, I would never talk about in public necessarily, but that's deeply vulnerable. And I don't even have a specific example at the moment. But I remember there's been moments like that where I felt safe, it was comfortable, and I knew I wouldn't be judged because this person knew me deeply and knew me for decades. and it would lead to, I noticed that vulnerability creates a space where, you know, when you step a foot in, it allows the other person to step a foot in also. You know, I open up about something in my life, and all of a sudden the other person goes, oh yeah, you know, we have this depth of relationship. They can bring in something from their life, and it leads to a sort of more pure, deeper connection that perhaps was lacking. So that's one big upside, at least I've observed, when you do choose to be, you know, a little bit vulnerable in any relationship.
Yeah, beautifully said.
I also love what you were saying about like how there's almost like this vulnerability can be looked as this way to be open to life and what life is offering in the moment. And often there is that, you know, dichotomy of like, oh man, it's difficult. Like, do I really want to talk about this? Do we really want to go here? Whether it's with your spouse, family member, friend, you know, you could try to like, yeah, let's not talk about that. Like you said, shelve it for later. But at the same time, there's a bit of that courage maybe, or the knowing that, okay, being vulnerable could lead to something beautiful. It could also lead to, you know, a heated argument or a heated debate. Anything is possible. It's life. But I like how you put it, which was you're more open to life. One of the things that's coming up, and this is more actually even in the corporate world, where you notice there's some tension between yourself and a colleague, and like maybe the conversations are flying around you, and it's not fully, you know, you're in meetings or you're having certain interactions, and you just notice like, oh yeah, there's some barrier with this person. And again, I don't know, this is how this came about for me. So when you said, hey, it's not a skill, I'm kind of wondering about that. You know, is it a skill? Is it a behavior? How did I learn to do this behavior? Because I've noticed for myself, I would find a time with that colleague, take 10, 15 minutes, sometimes 20-minute walk with that person one-on-one. And I would just share what I've been feeling. Like, hey, we've been in these meetings. I've noticed we sort of just cross over each other, or we don't fully make a connection. And it feels like you're walking away feeling pressured or not good about a decision. And I'm feeling the same way. You know, can we talk about this? And, you know, here's what I experienced. And what are you experiencing? How are you, you know, how am I being perceived? And you know, have I done something or said something that may have pissed you off that's leading to this? So can we look at that? And that has opened up. So far, I've yet to come across an example where that didn't work, where the other person wasn't receptive because I chose to be, you know, a little bit vulnerable, and again in a safe space, one-on-one. But it has turned around relationships 180 degrees, where it would have been like, man, I don't even want to see this person, to the point where it's like we have this greater depth of relationship that would have felt impossible. I'm curious, Dolphin, like, you know, you having worked in this space for so long, from what I'm describing, how do you describe this dynamic, or is it just as simple as someone chose to be vulnerable, or is there something deeper going on here?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great story. I think it's one that we can all relate to, and it's one that has a lot of degrees to it. You know, you can get vulnerable with the person at the grocery store that you've never met before, but there's a certain kind of vulnerability that makes sense there, or that is appropriate to that relationship. And then you can get vulnerable with your mom or your dad, people who brought you into this world, and there's again a different context for that vulnerability. Look at or just notice is that, again, this is my framing, and semantics matter. I think it's often we have conversations without having clarified what we mean by what we're saying, and you don't want to spend your whole conversation in semantics, but sometimes it's relevant. And so I'll just point out, like, for me, vulnerability is not a skill. I've talked to a lot of other coaches and therapists and people who have, you know, explored vulnerability a lot, and they don't agree with me, and that's fine. And a lot of times we're actually saying the same things, but the words mean different things to us. But for me, vulnerability, the essence of vulnerability is about an openness and an availability, especially to what's difficult. There's a kind of opening that we choose. I choose to open here in spite of knowing that it's uncomfortable or difficult or painful or unknown. We don't know where this openness to what's going on is going to lead us. And that's empowering to me, because then it means that in spite of my history and my past and my wounds and all of that, I can be with this moment in a way that's what I might call clean. Like, I'm not going to get in the way. And then you said something interesting that I think is valuable and bears out people who have really explored vulnerability, which is you did that and you described opening up a space. When we're vulnerable, we're choosing to make room for and not get in the way, not crowd what can and wants to come through. And then I'll frame one more thing that I think is relevant before I kind of answer your question, which is, if vulnerability, like look at a baby and a young child, like they are utterly vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not really choosing that. At that point, that's just their innate way. But just because we grow into a developmental stage where we're able to choose to not be vulnerable doesn't mean that vulnerability isn't still our innate way. It just means we've laid a capacity over top of that innate space, that spacious openness and availability to life. And what I would say is that people that struggle with vulnerability will always have good reason. They came into this world as this open-hearted, vulnerable baby and young child, and if it wasn't safe, if there was pain and shame and judgment and criticism and hurt and harm in their vulnerability, then the likelihood is nearly 100% that they will create a kind of conditioned cover and coping strategies to mitigate their own vulnerability, to mitigate the consequences of their own vulnerability. So that's at play in pretty much every human being on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
That we were deeply and fundamentally vulnerable, that we were hurt and harmed and mistreated, and we looked and found ways to not be so vulnerable, to protect ourselves. And the story you mentioned is a story of not just vulnerability, like you initiated that conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that really matters. So I believe that there's vulnerability, which is a kind of openness to the present moment as it is, a space within which what's really there can be and to come through. I believe there's a process that I shared in the initial practice in the podcast of listening and beginning to translate what life is really calling on us to be and do. And then there's action. And when that openness and vulnerability is there, when the honest listening is there, and when there's a responsiveness or an action to what we discover in that listening, we are now in full participation with life. And because human beings are fundamentally relational creatures, and we fundamentally want to be seen and known, and we want to belong in a meaningful way, again, it's not a magic wand. Some people are committed to their protection. But in many cases, providing that invitation, providing the, like, hey, human being over there, I'm a human being over here, and I'm going to be vulnerable with you. I'm going to make this safe to be this open. That practice and that act in relation to others becomes a powerful invitation for others to join us.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all sorts of skills that might also go along with navigating those conversations and those relationships. But at the core of it are those three things that I just outlined: this openness and vulnerability to life, this listening and kind of hearing the message of life, and then being willing to act in response to what we hear. And then in that, we can discover all of what's most meaningful about connection and relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Just perfectly said. And I love that you just gave us a framework there too. I think that's so helpful. And as we're all talking, and there's a lot coming up as you know, kind of images coming through that I want to share as you're bringing up all these different things, both of you guys. And there was something that happened about 10 minutes ago in the show, and we might cut it out, we might not, but the three of us didn't talk for about a minute. And what I noticed was that we looked at each other. And obviously the three of us are trained coaches, but there's like a getting comfortable with the discomfort that can happen in those moments. You know what I mean? Like we're looking at each other and it's like, who's going to talk? Well, it doesn't matter. Let's give it space. And that right there to me is an example of being vulnerable. Of here's three of us in a room. No one needed to take charge. No one needed to have an agenda. Who cares what if someone's going to get upset listening? It's just like, hey, let's just sit. And then let's see what comes forward when one of us was ready. And I feel like we modeled that well. And there's, as you're talking too, there's so many things around space. And you said it's almost like a light in the room. And I've heard rapport referred to as how much light is in the room or how much light isn't in the room. And I think what we're getting at is vulnerability is on that similar spectrum of how like a dimmer. You know, how vulnerable am I and how vulnerable am I not? And there is no real right or wrong way to be in that moment. It's in this moment. How willing am I to be open to space and feedback and criticism and truth? Because sometimes you're just not, and that's okay too. And maybe that's when we don't open up and be as vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an importance here of taking care of ourselves and knowing, hey, am I in a space to really hear? Am I in a space for feedback? Am I in a space where I want to take action? Because if not, then it's okay to turn that dimmer down on the amount of vulnerability you're willing to share in that moment. And there's beautiful things there. I have an example that just came up recently is I've been actively working on not parenting my others. I've been actively working on parenting myself. And with Thanksgiving coming up, I received a call from my mom who wanted me to step in between her and my father and have a conversation for them. And I initially said, yeah, I'm willing to do that. Right. I'm willing to go ahead and play that role. And then I thought about it over the week. And as Thanksgiving's getting closer and closer and closer, I said, you know what? I'm working on not parenting people. I'm especially working on not parenting my parents. So I said to myself, I don't think I'm willing to do this. I don't think I'm willing to have the conversation. So I asked my wife, asked my brother, said, what do you guys think? And that's being open. And they could have said, nope, you need to have the conversation. They both said, you know what? I don't think you need to have it. So then it was kind of like you're saying, Kasper, it's like, okay, here I have the awareness. I had the desire. Then the next thing was, am I actually going to tell my mother I'm not going to come in and save the day? And I felt into it and I said, yeah, okay, let's send her the message and say, hey, Mom, for these reasons, I'm not willing to step in. And that felt really vulnerable. That felt really open. And what I'm also noticing there's a sense of fearlessness that comes with being vulnerable. Like, am I willing to get a no? Am I willing to get some harsh feedback? Am I willing for my mother to be upset with me? And that's a choice, right? And then a lot of times too, if we're able to drop expectations and assumptions, then we can act more openly. And I sent her the message and said, hey, I'm not willing to do this. And in a beautiful way, she goes, wow, thank you. I didn't know that I was putting you into a tough situation. I didn't think about that I was going to put you in between us. And she goes, no problem. Totally get it. And it was such a cool experience of everything you kind of just discussed, Dolphin, of the awareness, the action, doing it, the fearlessness. And then it's like, and the other person goes, you know what? Thanks for telling me that. I didn't know that. And it went so much, it went so much better than it did in my mind, right? Which I think can happen. That I've noticed that happens more often than not. Mm-hmm. Our minds create these worlds and these frames and these pictures of how bad it's going to go. And if you come in with some openness, some clarity, some space, my money's on it tends to go a lot better than you think. And sometimes it goes perfectly well. I would say it always goes perfect, but I wanted to share that. Those are all coming up as you guys are talking. And I really appreciate the openness and the vulnerability that we've created in this space for this to come through. I don't have a question, but I wanted to share that. So if you guys have something you want to respond with, please feel free.
Yeah, I can share one thing too, actually, Nick, as where we ended and what you were just talking about, Nick, as well, is like, it's almost like I sense this sense of where we make up all these stories around being vulnerable, and like there's even a feeling in me right now that it's like, oh man, this is like a risky, dangerous conversation, or this whole, being vulnerable business. And is it worth it? But everything, when I describe the experience, or I look back at the times when I was vulnerable, it's like, oh yeah, that was completely worth it. Having that conversation with my friend or the colleague or someone in my family, that was completely worth it. we came to a better understanding of what was happening than me just making up stories in my head of like, oh yeah, that person is just like this, or that situation is always like this, or they always tend to do this to me, versus sitting with those assumptions. I was able to walk in with what I think helped was I walked in with a pure intent of understanding. And I think if I walked into a vulnerable conversation with an agenda to prove myself or hurt the other person in some way, I don't think it would have gone well. But because I was both willing to share what my perception of the situation was and also truly hear if the other person felt, I was open to feedback. Had I done something wrong? Is there something I could change about my way of behavior so that we could have a better relationship? And I notice if I drop those assumptions and I find myself doing this constantly around my family and friends also, is like, someone will jump to a conclusion of like, yeah, let's not worry about that person. I was like, hey, let's not jump to a conclusion. I feel like we have a feeling associated with this situation, but we don't have concrete evidence that suggests this person was actually being mean spirited or whatever. And so that was really coming up. It was like, okay, yeah, there is an aspect where we're creating stories of, are we making it overly dangerous or risky than it really is? And what will be the benefit of walking into a conversation or interaction with someone if we did choose to be that vulnerable, that could actually magnificently make this a beautiful relationship than what it is today?
Yeah, I mean, the pieces that you two are bringing forward with family, I think, are rich because, of course, those relationships run deep, and a lot of people aren't present to the fact that what plays out, especially with our relationships with our parents, is mostly stuff that has its roots in our pre-verbal life. So like in utero, your development is being influenced by how your mom is doing, how her relationships are going, how safe and secure she feels in life becomes a kind of foundation from which you make sense of life. And so then interacting with them touches into all of that pre-verbal development, right? And so Rick, it sounds like you have a relationship with your mom that at least at this point is pretty open, and there's a lot of trust, and you can come forward with something that in some way displaces her preference, and that she can receive that. And in a way, I would point to that as a primary place for us to look when we want to start to do honest and earnest relationship work. Is we do what we do in a practiced way because on some level it's worked for us. And then what that means is, based on the way in which we have contextualized things and the way in which we have organized a kind of hierarchy of values, those behaviors seem to be the best approach to honor those levels of value that are at play. That doesn't mean the context is right. It doesn't mean we've done a good job of organizing the hierarchy of values. It just means those behaviors are there because they've quote unquote worked. And if we can start to sense and see and feel that our practiced way of being in relationship is maybe not optimal, maybe it's not our most authentic self, or it's not our highest expression, we actually have to come face to face with the reality that we will need to displace our preferences and everything those preferences do for us if we're going to start to get to the root of these patterns, clear and clean them up in a way that allows us to be fully ourselves and fully expressed, and simultaneously in full relationship with the people we're close to. And so, that what I just said there is like, that's a lot, but there's places for us to start, especially, when, as the holidays approach, something, for some of us, there's like dread and trepidation. For some of us, it's a warm, fuzzy excitement. But for all of us, it's a coming back into close proximity with the people that we have our longest standing relationships with. And in that, it's one of the most fruitful times of the year for us, and an opportunity to deepen existing beautiful relationships, or an opportunity to come face to face with and start to clear and clean up pieces that are incomplete with us and maybe our parents or our relatives. So happy to get into that or any other kind of direction the two of you want to go.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect place. And there's one more piece I want to add in, Dolphin, that you just reminded me of is, as you were kind of saying, we're like, we've learned these behaviors, and then at some point we're deciding if we want to upgrade them or not, right? And it's, my mom said to me, she said, "Oh, I didn't realize that this was going to affect you." And what I responded was I wouldn't have realized that either a year ago. right? It's like, yeah, a year ago, I didn't have the awareness I was doing this, and I didn't know that there was a different way of being. Now that I have a framework, now that I have some practice, now I can choose, do I want to go with the old pattern or do I want to go with the new pattern? And then let's see what that does for the relationship. Well, fuck, it's making it better. It's making it more open. So that was a really cool piece that you just brought up for me there. What, with that framework you just laid out, Thanksgiving's coming, Christmas is coming. It brings up a ton of stuff, familiar stuff, things we're not even aware of. Where do we start? I think we could go into this forever, but where do we start? Let's say Thanksgiving's this Thursday. It is. We walk into the house, we're feeling anxious, stuff's coming up. Where do we start?
Yeah. So great question. I'll rewind a little bit from that moment at Thanksgiving and just say, if something is coming and there's a kind of electricity or resonance or just recognition of these are important interactions or moments, and you also know that it's not clear to you that it's going to go just right, that's a signal to you that there are things you can do to prepare. And I use something in my coaching as well as my own life. I worked with athletes for years, but one of the things that is really helpful in preparation for something that does involve levels of skill and preparation is to do rehearsal. And so, if these are gatherings that you're used to, people you're used to, you can imagine, for sure, you can imagine how it's gone, right? Your memory of past happenings, and you can imagine how it will go. And the more you give yourself a chance to create those scenarios and be in them, try not to be the observer, right? Like I have a critique of the observer approach to kind of opening up situations. There's value there, but the observer itself, actually, if you really look at it, is a dissociative practice. Like, oh, I'm over here watching life happening over there. And for me, the most valuable is, can I become more open and present in the midst of life, in the midst of the interaction, in the midst of my own experience, versus being some kind of distant observer? And if you can do that, what will likely happen, if you're good at that, you will start to feel the things that you'll feel in that moment. Memory is a good tool for that. Like, you remember something and your body starts to feel that way. Your heart rate starts to go up. There's a tension across your chest, as an example of maybe a less positive experience. All of that is perfect. It's the perfect thing for you to practice how you want to be, how you want to notice and choose vulnerability, how you want to respond if and when you feel stuck or shut down, or they say the thing that most bothers you, the thing you can kind of predict that they would say. Give yourself a chance to regularly be in that moment and feel it and notice what there is to notice. Notice, oh, that trigger, oh, I'm just starting to notice that trigger in me is actually about this other thing that happened. Or, wow, when I say that, I can see that what I really want to say is this other thing. So just a really honest, open rehearsal of these scenarios becomes really powerful. And what rehearsal does is it gives us conscious, embedded memory and access to the same perspective and learnings when we become dysregulated. You're not going to create any brand new skills or levels of awareness in the midst of a dysregulated state. But you can come back to, or you can activate existing ones. And so I think that's one of the most powerful things we can possibly do. That's why it's helpful to work with a coach or to do programs or workshops, or like you get to kind of practice in a safe space with facilitated support, being in these states and doing different things with them. And this internal rehearsal is a powerful method. If you have someone in your life that wants to practice conversations with you and you can get a little bit more kind of gestalt, then that's even more powerful. But this practice of remembering and projecting scenarios and experiences that might be edgy or difficult, noticing what there is to notice, feeling your body in them, noticing your inclination towards certain reactions, and then finding ways to be more open to the experience and to be more attuned to what really wants to happen, and to watch yourself responding and communicating in ways that would feel most empowering to you and the other, will set you up to be more capable of doing that in real time when those moments happen. So that's a super practical one that everyone can do, and that I think, if you were serious about it and you wanted to do it a lot, you would get a lot better at these moments quickly. So that's how powerful that practice is.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so,
thanks. That was good.
something, to add, like, just another take of something I've been doing myself. And I just want to share, to add on to what Dolphin you just shared around rehearsals, and even I never thought about practicing with someone else. I'd often just be doing this in my own mind. But something that's really helped is, like, I would picture myself with this person now. So going into this whatever it might be, the event, whether it's Thanksgiving or another family get together, and imagining myself the conversation I want to have and in the way I want to have. So there's degrees of relationships, and maybe it's a difficult one, or maybe it's just something that's pending, but actually seeing myself, more of a mental rehearsal is just what I'm pointing to. And seeing myself having that conversation, the way I show up, what energy am I bringing, did I greet this person, did I actually make good eye contact, did I show up from a loving place, if that's what I want to create. And then what kind of conversation do we have? What do we talk about? Like, is there something we connect on? Is there a past memory of a great time that I had with this person that maybe has gotten forgotten? And to be able to reconnect with that and bring some of that energy back into the situation. So I just wanted to share that it has helped a ton in going into, especially when you're going to walk into a place where you feel some uncomfortable energy around someone, and actually really picturing a conversation with that person. And how is that conversation going to be different? And it's almost like, I think it's pointing to something you were saying earlier, Dolphin, where we create the capacity. So it's almost like going through this rehearsal creates a mental, physical capacity in your being, so that when you're actually in that moment, you've now up-leveled your capacity at least somewhat than what it was before. And so you have that capacity to show up in that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to throw a framework in here too. As you're going into the weekend, think about two things. How do I want to be? And what are my intentions? And if you set those before you go in, how do I want to be? Okay, I want to be loving. There you go. That's how I want to be. So then every interaction that comes up with family, that's how you're telling yourself, your system, how you want to be. The intention, I want to be present. I want to be non-judgmental. I want to be curious. And then when you get off course, then you have an anchor point to go, oh, I'm not being my intention. I'm not showing up how I wanted to. Well, then now you have something to go back to. Those are great things. And Dolphin before had mentioned you can go into the past and you can touch an emotion, you can touch an experience, and you can bring that into the present moment and you can feel it. So this is something that athletes do. Well, if it works in the past, it also works in the future. You can project yourself into the future and envision how you want to be and how you want to show up. And then you can feel that emotion, that sensation, that way of being in this present moment. And then now, once you've got it here, then you walk into the room with it. So then you're using visualization, preparation to get yourself in a state to then walk in how you want to be. So use those three. How do you want to be? What are your intentions? And then practice getting into the state. And then when you've gotten there, now you've practiced, you've done it. So it'll help big time. So those are really cool stuff. They're getting into some physiology now.
Mm-hmm.
Dolphin, anything on that? And then also, as we kind of wrap up, I'd love to hear you kind of just any final thoughts on relationships and vulnerability and anything we've touched on.
Yeah. Well, what was coming up as especially Nick, what you just framed that I thought was relevant is, in the exercise physiology and the sports psychology world, what they've discovered is that the difference between anxiety and excitement are essentially zero, like in the body. The same things, galvanic skin response and heart rate and breathing rate and all these other things physiologically, that your body is doing the same thing when it's afraid than when it's excited. And so then there may be some conditioned pieces around how and why the kind of where excitement and fear or anxiety kind of diverge, but they're similar enough that we can start to go, well, what's the difference between someone who approaches something and is afraid of it versus someone who's excited about it? And a huge part of it is the story that we've told ourselves about this, like what I say, this kind of experience. So that's what our nervous system and our unconscious mind is doing. It's sense making around what is this like, and then it's creating reflexive solutions that have worked, evolutionarily, but also personally in our lives. And it's executing on those things to have us be ready. And that's a survival mechanism, but it's also an evolutionary mechanism. It's something that we can grow through. And so one thing I might encourage someone to do is, if there's a place in your close relationships where you feel shut down or afraid, or you don't feel yourself giving yourself a chance to show up in the way you most want to start to explore, like, what is it about this that I'm most afraid of? What is it that I have aversion to or that I'm afraid of? And what would it mean for me to be excited to engage it? And then I'll give you just a really brief story that I think is relevant. So a while back, I went and did some plant medicine, some ayahuasca, and I wanted to go like wherever it wanted to take me. And so my preparation was very stringent. For about 6 weeks, I was on like the most strict dieta you could do. And I wanted it to show me whatever I'd been avoiding. And so I went in, there was quite a bit of anxiety in my body, like intensity. There was, the arousal in my body was significant. And I wanted something to ground me in preparation for, but also in the journey that I was taking on. And what I came to was, I don't want to miss any of this. Like, when I'm really honest, when it comes to life, like at the end of my life, I don't want to look back and say, oh, like I avoided life. I want to be here for all of it. And so that became a kind of mantra during my preparation and on my journeys. That is like, I don't want to look away from anything. I actually want all of this. And, if that resonates with you, use it. If it doesn't, find something that allows you to recontextualize what you've been afraid of. And then one of the best ways we can do that is, what's the opportunity? Instead of looking at the cost or the risk, what is the opportunity? And that's what we notice in successful athletes, is that their body is doing very much the same thing as the scared, unsuccessful athlete. But what they're tending to, with awareness and with attention and with intention, is, what is the opportunity for me in this competition? And then it immediately changes what that physiological state is in service to. It's not in service to shutting down and avoiding something. It's in service to activating and moving towards something. And so that's something we can use in our personal and relational lives as well.
It's just such a simple reframe. What am I afraid of? What's the opportunity here? Getting from scarcity to abundance. So that's perfectly said. Kasper, this has been tremendously informational and inspirational for us. I know. Would you mind telling our audience, how they can get in touch with you, anything you have going on, maybe any programs that you'd like to share? We'll put in the notes too, but if there's anything you'd like to tell us about specifically before we close out, we'd love to know what you're up to and where to get in contact with you.
Yeah. So I'm easy to find. Dolphin Kasper, my last name. So Dolphin, like the animal. My last name is Kasper with a K, Kasper. So dolphinkasper.com is my website. Dolphin Kasper is my handle on all the social media sites. So you can easily find me and reach out to me there. I'm constantly writing and sharing video content of all kinds on the different platforms. I have something I'm actually sharing with my mom, who I work together with quite a bit in my professional life. We're going to create something we're calling Heal the Holidays, and that's a support program for people that want to make a shift around how it's been with their family in the holidays. And so we'll be sharing that. That'll be something you can find through Facebook and Instagram. But again, you can feel free to message me anywhere. I work with people one-on-one. I work with couples. I have some group coaching programs, and always looking for opportunities to be able to share what I do and sort of how I've brought things together in the form of speaking or workshops, all that kind of stuff. So I'm available for people that want to work with me, and encourage you all, if you liked what you heard and you want some more, please get in touch, follow, and let's keep the conversation going.
That's
Perfect.
wonderful.
Well, I liked what I heard. I'm in.
Yeah.
Sweet.
I was going to say, that's wonderful that you're doing that for the holidays and putting something, putting a program together that really will help people navigate, some of those anxious family reunions. So I look forward to checking it out as well. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you guys for inviting me. I really appreciate the flavor and sort of trajectory of the podcast. And this is our first time really meeting each other. And so I look forward to staying aware of what you're up to and all the places where we might kind of come together and collaborate again. I'm available to the conversation as well.
Likewise. thanks so much for being on. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you had a great conscious conversation with all of us. And be sure to like and follow the podcast if it meant anything to you, and share it with someone who you think could use to learn everything we just talked about. So have a happy holidays to everyone out there, and be easy with yourselves, with your family. All right.